Will you pray with me just for a moment? May the good Spirit speak a word to us through the words of this unworthy servant. This is our prayer. Amen. Two or 3 weeks ago, an elderly man whom I visit on a fairly regular basis asked me an interesting question. He's a lovely fellow, well into his 80s. He was a commando in the Second World War, but he's lost the use of his legs. He hasn't lost the use of his brain, though, and I find visiting him a great joy. I hope he enjoys it half as much as I do. When I went to see him 2 or 3 weeks ago, he asked me if I thought Jesus had a sense of humor. And I think what lay behind that was the depiction of Jesus in the Gospels, and indeed just about everything else you find in the New Testament can leave you decidedly unsure whether humor even existed at that time, certainly among the Christians anyway. Christian scripture, what we call the New Testament, is for the most part deadly serious in its intent and in its content. So, could Jesus have had a sense of humor? I gave this man my emphatic yes, and I told him my 3 reasons for saying that. First, Jesus was Jewish. Going back thousands of years, and I'll explain in a minute why I'm saying that, going back thousands of years, Jews have produced a greater legacy of humor than any other ethnic or religious group we have known. You just consider in our own, well, my time anyway, because I'm a lot older than some of you, but I can remember these people. Consider some of them. Woody Allen, Jack Benny, Marty Feldman, Danny Kaye, Tom Lehrer, Jerry Lewis, the Marx Brothers. Who have I left out? Charlie Chaplin. And, of course, right up to date, Sacha Baron Cohen. Oh, dear. Borat. And women? Of course. You think of women like Judy Holliday and Joan Rivers, Goldie Hawn, Bette Midler, and the list goes on. All Jewish. So that's my first reason for saying Jesus must have had a sense of humor. He was Jewish. Second, though, the Old Testament, better referred to as the Hebrew Scriptures, has heaps of humor in it. It is full of irony, sarcasm, puns, double entendres, word plays, funny names, funny imagery and exaggeration, and comic situations. Some of it is really rather coarse also. Don't ask me afterwards for that, though, will you? But much of it is subtle, and it doesn't translate easily because it's in Hebrew. And understanding it requires some knowledge of Hebrew. But it is there, folks, and Jesus would have grown up with that. And my third reason, I'm in no doubt that Jesus had a sense of humor, is that he was a storyteller par excellence. Harvey Cox, one-time theologian at Harvard Divinity School, says there has never been a better raconteur than Jesus of Nazareth. And so it was. As Mark the Gospel writer tells us, the common people heard him gladly. So why did they hear him gladly? Because he made good listening, that's why. And why did he make good listening? It was partly what he said, but it was also the way he said it. And so don't let anyone tell you that Jesus was a stuffy, stitched up, stolid individual. That's a libel on Jesus. The distinguished Quaker Elton Trueblood, who was one time chaplain at Harvard, wrote a book on the humor of Jesus, pointing out that when you look behind the somewhat two-dimensional prose of the New Testament, you see that many of the sayings of Jesus in their original form, which was in Aramaic, could have been quite witty the first time they were heard. And unquestionably, when he told that story about a camel, which Lorraine read this morning, they would have all fallen about laughing. So, to that inquiry if Jesus had a sense of humor, my answer is undoubtedly yes. And this means that if you and I see ourselves as somehow being Jesus people, Jesus followers, then a hearty sense of humor is a spiritual gift that we should all covet and cultivate. And I have 3 reasons for saying that this morning, why having a hearty sense of humor is a good thing. It makes us better rounded persons. It makes us better resourced persons. And it makes us better received persons. First, better rounded people. A hearty sense of humor directed in the first instance at ourselves is one of the best indicators of a healthy personality, of being a well-rounded person. A few years ago, researchers at the University of California in Berkeley and at the University of Zurich in Switzerland studied 70 psychology students. Apologies, Dr. Campbell, I'm not singling out psychologists for special treatment, wherever you are. 70 psychology students were studied to gauge their ability to laugh at themselves. First, the students were asked to rate their own ability to see something hilarious in a situation that affected them. And then they had to designate a close friend who was prepared to give them an estimate of them in the same terms. Now, while they were filling out some questionnaires, there was a hidden camera snapping pictures of these students. These images were modified in the style of those distorting mirrors that you see at Luna Park and elsewhere, and maybe even that your grandchildren have done with pictures of you, as mine have with me, and I look even worse than normal. Now, the students were shown a whole sequence of these images, distorted images of people who were not known to them, along with their own silly-looking images interspersed in there. When they saw their own, 80% of them laughed. 20% couldn't see anything funny at all. But those who did laugh were those who had said ahead of time that they thought they had the ability to laugh at themselves, and whose assessment was corroborated by friends. Those were the ones who really cracked up and fell about guffawing at these crazy images of themselves. And the author of the report on this project canvassed a very interesting idea that there were some connecting links between humor and humility. And she concluded her observations by saying, sometimes we all just need a reminder to take everything, including ourselves, less seriously. Now, one person who I think exemplifies this rather well, certainly in my judgment, is Danny Katz. Know Danny Katz? Mr. Katz lives in Melbourne with his wife and children. He's a columnist with The Age, with the Sydney Morning Herald, and with the West Australian. He also has an advice column in the Good Weekend, I think, and he writes children's books. He was born in Canada, and he came here as a youngster, and he is, of course, Jewish. He began a recent column in The Age by referring to his working with children permit. He does quite a lot of work with children, and he was referring especially to his little plastic card with a picture on him. Looks a bit like your license. Have you ever looked worse than in that image on your driving license? I haven't. Anyway, Danny Katz said of this little plastic card, he said, "This didn't look like someone who should be working with children." He said, my unfortunate photographic problem may have a little something to do with my unfortunately unphotogenic face. I have a very bad case of Jewish Canadian head, a medical condition where you develop a disturbing combination of Jewish and Canadian heritages. The Jewish bit being my wonky, wacky facial features, and the Canadian bit being a general fatness from eating too many pancakes with side orders of Canadian bacon. Mr. Katz. Anyway, Mr. Katz went on to say about the photo that accompanies his column in The Age, that flabby neck fat like a permanent aeroplane travel cushion worn backwards. My face, he said, just screams unphotogenic. You can hear it coming down the street. It keeps my family awake at night. Now, a man who can write a column like that exemplifies the very best kind of humor, that which begins by being able to laugh at one's own absurdity, as we actually sang just now in that hymn. It makes for a better rounded person. Now that leads me into the second thing I want to say. A good sense of humor makes you into a better resourced person. I should think there'd be fairly widespread agreement that the Jews' reputation for humor arises out of their having to cope over many, many centuries with an almost incredible history of hardship, through slavery in Egypt and 40 years wandering in the wilderness, through exile and captivity in Babylonia, through Roman occupation, and through 2 millennia of anti-Semitism in the Christian dispensation. Humor has been a kind of survival kit for Jewish people. And there's a sense in which humor is power, you see, power to endure and to overcome. Just think about that. Humor can be an enormously potent generator of moral and spiritual courage in a downtrodden people. I just remind you what some of the wise and witty have said about humor. We put some of these in your order of service, which we want you to take home today and reflect on these as a kind of aid memoir. They're in there somewhere. Mahatma Gandhi, the great 20th century social reformer and the mentor of Martin Luther King, said, "If I had no sense of humor, I would long ago have committed suicide." Wow. Thomas Higginson, who was a 19th century American preacher and a passionate campaigner for the abolition of slavery, said, "There is no defense against adverse fortune which is so effectual as an habitual sense of humor." And Henry Ward Beecher, the great 19th century congregational preacher and the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Beecher was another abolitionist, and he was what today would probably be called a progressive Christian. And Beecher said, a man without a sense of humor is like a wagon without springs, jolted by every pebble in the road. Ouch. And Mark Twain, bless him, said, humor is the great thing, the saving thing. The minute it crops up, all our irritation and resentment slip away, and a sunny spirit takes their place. Now, maybe it's all about keeping things in perspective, and I'm going to tell this story. I know half of you have already heard it, probably, but for the sake of those of you who haven't heard it, I'll tell it again. It's the story about the girl in boarding school. Recognize it yet? She writes home to mother. Dear mother, the letter goes, my life has undergone some changes, and I need to share these with you. I have been meeting after dark with the school gardener in the potting shed. It's not funny. What? They're laughing, Reese. What are they laughing at? I wouldn't be laughing if I got a letter like this from one of my daughters. It gets worse. We have fallen in love and have become intimate, she writes. I believe I may now be pregnant. One other thing, Mother. Last week a fire raced through the boarding house. My room was gutted, and all I have now is what I'm wearing. Your loving daughter. Well, now, naturally, Mother flew into hysterics, paced back and forth, shrieking, George, what are we going to do now? And George, being a typical man, was pretty useless. Next day, another letter comes. Dear Mother, I haven't been meeting the gardener in the potting shed. We're not in love, and I'm still a virgin. We didn't have a fire in the boarding house either. But I did fail mathematics, and I wanted you to keep things in perspective. Christopher Morley wasn't great at mathematics, although his father was a mathematics professor, but Morley became a distinguished writer. You may remember his name when I tell you that he wrote the novel Kitty Foyle, which was made into an Academy Award-winning film that starred the young Ginger Rogers. Oh, how I wish I could have danced like that woman, even better, danced with her. Mm-hmm. Remember Ginger Rogers? Come on. Those of you who are my generation, of course you remember her. My wife, who read my script ahead of time, said to me, just remember, John, that it was said Ginger Rogers could dance just as well as Fred Astaire, only in high heels and going backwards. Why did you make me put that in? Anyway, why do I mention Christopher Morley? Well, Morley said, humor is a sense of intellectual perspective and awareness that some things are really important and others are not, and that the two kinds are most oddly jumbled in everyday affairs. Now, I want to go into my last point, which is that those with a healthy sense of humor are not only better rounded, not only better resourced, they're also better received. I think you could say they are better remembered also. Fairly obvious, isn't it? Recall how I said at the start that it was impossible to believe Jesus could have been a stitched-up, stolid, stuffy individual. Had it been so, nobody would have wanted to be with him. And the gospel would certainly not have said, the common people heard him gladly. And you remember that the single major criticism of Jesus had to do with the terrible company that he kept. These were the people drawn to him. I want to bring this to a close by telling you about a university don who, at first blush, sounds like a real paradox. His name is John Morell. John Morell is now well into his 60s. Well, that makes him a young man, doesn't it? And he's well into his 60s. He's a professor of religion at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now, the College of William and Mary was founded in 1693, and it's the second oldest research university in the US after Harvard. Morell's courses, wait for them, I can see you rushing off to enroll in these, yes. Morell's courses include theory and method in the study of religion. Wow, they say. Roman Catholicism since 1800. Woo, can't wait for it. Modern religious thought, and so on. You want to enroll in these courses? I can see you stampeding there. No, I can't. But I said Morell was a paradox, and I'll tell you why. This is because his books include Taking Laughter Seriously, Comedy, Tragedy, and Religion, and more recently a book called Humour, Works, The Benefits of Humour in the Workplace. So what's Morell's real interest? Is it humour or is it religion? It's both. He has been teaching at the College of William and Mary university courses on humour for 30 years. Well-subscribed courses too, I tell you. He's been running seminars and conferences on the place of humour as a social lubricant in the workplace. And coincidentally, I had sitting alongside me when I was preparing this address the promo for a workshop at the Holiday Inn in Singapore on the theme, Sense of Humour, Bringing Fun Back into Your Workplace. That was on just a few weeks ago. Picking up on Professor Morell, it's a reminder of the obvious that a sense of humour helps to make good things happen. And I close with this story. One who brought this notion to his work was the late Dr. Leslie Newbigin, minister of the Church of Scotland, who spent many, many years working in India and who became one of the first bishops of the Church of South India. Newbigin had that modestly self-deprecating sense of humour, but he could also focus it very clearly on some of his fellow ecclesiastics. He wrote innumerable limericks to while away the time in boring church gatherings. And that's why there were so many limericks. Well, I used to draw caricatures when I sat on synod boards and committees. Mercifully, I think they've all gone in the shredder. I would have been in trouble otherwise. And Bishop Newbigin was also remembered as the bishop who stood on his head in church to enliven a children's address. Newbigin was a long-time friend of Davis McCackey, the first president of the Uniting Church and governor of the state of Victoria in the late 80s. When McCackey retired as master of Ormond College, a volume of essays was published to honour him. The first essay in the book is by Dr. Leslie Newbigin. And in it he says, "Why haven't theologians reflected more about laughter. Why is it that some theologians have a sense of humour and others apparently not? Good question, isn't it, folks? May the good Spirit lead us gently back into a rediscovery of the intrinsic links between religion and humour. And God bless you.